Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I busted my ass for years to make sure my sister could follow her dreams. And then she turned around and treated me like I was dirt under her shoes. The whole thing happened at Christmas dinner, the one night of the year when family was supposed to come together, forget about their problems, share a meal, and pretend that everything was fine even if it wasn't. I had walked into my mother's house like I did every year, carrying a case of beer in one hand and a homemade casserole in the other, ready to sit down with the people I had spent my entire life protecting. The house smelled like pine needles and cinnamon. The fireplace crackled softly in the corner. And for the first few minutes, I actually let myself believe that maybe this year would be different. Maybe this year I wouldn't feel like an outsider in my own family. Jessica was already there, sitting at the dining table with her friends from law school, laughing in that polished, controlled way she had perfected over the years. She looked different from the little sister I had grown up with, the one who used to run around barefoot in the backyard, scraping her knees and climbing trees like she had no fear of falling. Now she sat with perfect posture, her nails painted in some expensive-looking shade of nude, her hair styled in a way that probably took an hour to get just right. She barely looked at me when I walked in, just glanced up, gave me a tight-lipped smile, then went back to whatever conversation she was having with her group of perfectly dressed, carefully curated friends. I should have known then, should have felt the shift in the air, should have recognized that this wasn't just another Christmas dinner, that something was coming, something I wouldn't be able to ignore. It wasn't until we all sat down to eat that it happened. The table was full of food, the kind of spread that made the house feel warm, that made you remember what it was like to be a kid, staring at a feast so big you didn't know where to start. My mom had outdone herself, like she always did, making sure there was enough for everyone to have seconds, thirds, even leftovers to take home. We were passing plates around, piling mashed potatoes on dishes, carving the turkey, laughing at old stories, when one of Jessica's friends turned to her and asked the question that changed everything. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice sweet but distant, like she wasn't really interested in the answer, just making polite conversation. "The guy at the end of the table?" Jessica didn't even look in my direction. "Oh," she said, waving a dismissive hand, her voice light, casual, completely unconcerned. "That's just Nick. My brother. He's a plumber." She said it like it was something embarrassing, something she wanted to brush over, something that wasn't worth discussing. Just Nick. Just a plumber. It was like someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over my head, like the entire room had gone silent, even though I could still hear the sound of forks scraping against plates, the hum of conversation continuing around me. For a second, I thought maybe I had misheard, maybe I was reading too much into it, maybe she didn't mean it the way it sounded. But then she kept talking, kept laughing, kept acting like the words that had just left her mouth didn't mean anything at all. "You know," she continued, reaching for a glass of wine, her voice still light and airy, like this was just another casual topic of conversation. "I thought it would be better if we kept things professional tonight. I mean, you guys are all studying law, working towards something big, and I didn't want to make things awkward by mixing different backgrounds." Different backgrounds. She didn't want to make things awkward. She didn't want her friends, the ones sitting in my mother's house, eating food my mother had cooked, drinking wine that had been paid for by my mother's hard-earned money, to feel uncomfortable being in the presence of a plumber. I stared at her for a long moment, waiting for her to realize what she had just said, waiting for her to feel even an ounce of guilt, waiting for her to acknowledge that she had just thrown me under the bus in front of an entire room of people. But she didn't. She just kept talking, kept smiling, kept pretending like she hadn't just kicked me in the gut with every word that had come out of her mouth. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, something unfamiliar, something I wasn't used to feeling when it came to Jessica. It wasn't disappointment. It wasn't even anger. It was something worse. It was the realization that she didn't respect me, that maybe she never had. I had spent years breaking my back to make sure she could chase her dreams, years making sacrifices she didn't even know about, years doing everything I could to protect her from the kind of struggle I had gone through. And in the end, none of it had mattered, because I wasn't good enough for her, because I was just a plumber. I didn't say anything. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't argue or yell or throw my fork down on the table like I wanted to. I just stood up. I pushed my chair back slowly, feeling the weight of every single pair of eyes in that room turning toward me, waiting for me to react, waiting for me to say something, waiting for me to make a joke or laugh it off like I always did. But I didn't. I picked up my coat, grabbed my keys off the counter, and walked toward the door, my footsteps heavy, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Nick." My mother's voice was soft, uncertain, confused. "Where are you going?" I hesitated for only a second, only long enough to take one final look at Jessica, still sitting at the table, still refusing to meet my eyes, still pretending like she hadn't just destroyed something between us that could never be repaired. Then I turned the doorknob, pulled the door open, and walked out into the cold December air without looking back. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what I was going to do next. But I knew one thing for damn sure. Jessica had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Jessica thought she had earned everything in life on her own. She had no idea who had been paying the bills. I sat in my truck for what felt like hours, staring at the glowing screen of my phone, watching as my sister posted another photo of herself at some high-end restaurant, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around the stem of a champagne flute, her caption oozing with self-congratulation. "Hard work pays off," she wrote, followed by some nonsense about manifesting success and never letting anyone hold you back. I could feel my blood pressure rising with every word, my jaw clenching so tightly I thought my teeth might crack under the pressure. Hard work? She wouldn't know hard work if it slapped her across the face. She thought she had done this all on her own. She thought she had clawed her way to the top through sheer determination, through talent, through some kind of natural brilliance that the universe had gifted her. She had no idea that every single step she had taken had been paid for by someone else, by me. I pulled a crumpled envelope from my glove compartment, the edges worn from being handled too many times, the ink slightly smudged from the countless times I had run my thumb over the numbers, as if trying to make sense of them. It was one of Jessica's law school tuition bills, addressed to her name, but never once seen by her eyes. Stamped across the bottom, in big, bold letters, was a word that she had never even considered might have come from someone other than herself. Paid. I had been covering her tuition since the day she got accepted. Not just tuition, rent, groceries, bills, whatever she needed whenever she needed it. She had never questioned where the money was coming from. Never once stopped to think about how she was able to afford law school without a mountain of debt crushing her shoulders. She just accepted it, assumed that mom had handled it, or maybe that some magical scholarship had appeared out of thin air, or maybe, just maybe, she really believed that the part-time work she did at her fancy law firm internship was enough to cover her entire life. She had no idea. I thought back to the day I made the decision to take care of her, the day I realized that my dreams weren't going to be a priority, because keeping my family afloat had to come first. I was just 18 when everything changed, still a kid, still dumb enough to believe that life was going to work out for me if I just followed the right path. I had a stack of college applications on my desk, a couple of acceptance letters, a vague plan for a future that, at the time, still seemed possible. And then Dad got sick. The hospital bills started rolling in faster than we could keep up, the mortgage payments fell behind, the credit card debt started piling up, and suddenly, the idea of going off to college felt like a selfish fantasy that I couldn't afford to entertain. Mom was barely holding it together, Jessica was too young to understand what was happening, and I had to make a choice, pursue my dreams or keep my family from drowning. So, I did what I had to do. I picked up my father's old wrench, the one he had used for decades, the one he had always told me was a tool that could fix anything if you knew what you were doing. I got an apprenticeship, started working 16-hour days, took every side job I could find, and made sure that my mother and sister never had to feel the weight of the struggle that had become my daily reality. I gave up everything so that Jessica wouldn't have to. And the worst part? She never even knew. For years, I had been wiring money into her account, covering her rent, her tuition, her bills, making sure she never had to worry about where her next meal was coming from or whether she could afford to buy books for school. I had stayed quiet, never told her the truth, never wanted her to feel like she owed me anything. But now, sitting in my truck, staring at her perfectly filtered Instagram post about how hard work pays off, I felt something inside me crack. She had called me just a plumber. She had laughed in front of her friends and acted like I was an embarrassment, like I was some working-class joke that didn't belong in the same room as her, like my presence was something she had to apologize for. And yet, every single part of her life, the apartment, the education, the security, had been built on my back, paid for with my sweat, funded by the very job she looked down on. I exhaled slowly, trying to push down the anger rising in my chest, trying to think rationally, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. I could call her, tell her everything, lay it all out in brutal detail, make her understand exactly what she had taken for granted all these years. I could show up at her apartment, slap the stack of paid tuition bills on her pristine marble countertop, and watch the color drain from her face as she realized that the life she had been bragging about wasn't hers to claim. But I didn't want to do that. I didn't want an apology. I didn't want her to cry and say she was sorry. I wanted her to feel it. I wanted her to understand, really understand, what it was like to stand on your own 2 feet without a safety net waiting to catch you when you fell. I wanted her to wake up one morning and realize that the money wasn't there, that the bills weren't paid, that the security she had taken for granted had been an illusion. I wanted her to learn the hard way. Pulling up my bank app, I scrolled through the automatic payments list, my thumb hovering over the screen for a moment, just long enough for me to second-guess myself. But the memory of her voice at Christmas dinner, the way she had dismissed me so effortlessly, the way she had laughed while stripping me of my dignity, hardened my resolve. I canceled the tuition payments first, then the rent, then the utilities, then the monthly grocery fund I had been sending her for years. One by one, I wiped away every piece of support I had ever given her, erasing every financial lifeline, every invisible hand that had been holding her up without her even realizing it. I didn't leave a warning. I didn't send a message. I didn't say a damn thing. Let her figure it out. Let her scramble. Let her feel what it was like to be blindsided by the weight of reality. And the best part? She wouldn't even see it coming. The first call came from the school, then the landlord, then the credit card company. Jessica's perfect little world was crumbling, and I just sat back and watched. It didn't happen all at once, didn't hit her like a single devastating blow that knocked her flat on her back. No, it came in waves, slow and steady at first. Little ripples that she probably thought were just minor inconveniences, small bumps in the road that she could smooth over with a quick phone call or a confident flick of her credit card. But the cracks were there, spreading beneath the surface, growing wider with every passing day, creeping into the foundation of the life she had so carefully built on money she thought was hers. I imagined her sitting in that fancy restaurant, dressed in one of her designer outfits, sipping an expensive cocktail, surrounded by people who had no idea that she wasn't really one of them, that her entire image had been funded by someone else. She would have been laughing, telling some story about law school, maybe bragging about how she was on track to land an internship at a prestigious firm, maybe even mentioning how she planned to move to New York after graduation, already picturing herself in some high-rise apartment with a view of the city. And then the bill came. She wouldn't have even looked at it at first, wouldn't have thought twice about handing her card to the waiter, flashing that effortless smile, expecting it to be returned with a polite nod and a simple, "Thank you, Miss Walker." But instead, the waiter would have hesitated, furrowed his brow, tapped the card reader a second time, and then leaned down to whisper the words that would send the first real crack through the perfect image she had built around herself. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your card has been declined." Jessica, being who she was, probably laughed it off at first, assuming it was some kind of mistake, maybe even rolling her eyes and making a joke about how banks were always freezing her card whenever she spent a little too much. She would have pulled out another card, waved it like a magician performing a cheap trick, confident that this one would go through without a problem. Declined. Maybe a third one, the emergency credit card she kept tucked away in her designer wallet, the one she had never really needed before because, until now, everything had always been taken care of. Declined. I could picture the way her face must have changed then, the way that confident, easy smile started to falter, the way the laughter at the table started to feel forced, the way the people around her exchanged glances, shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they realized something wasn't right. Jessica had never been embarrassed like this before. She had never been in a situation where she didn't have control, never experienced the kind of gut-wrenching panic that came with realizing that the numbers in her bank account weren't what she thought they were. She must have excused herself, stepping away from the table, her heart pounding as she pulled out her phone and checked her banking app, expecting to see some kind of temporary issue, maybe a fraud alert, maybe an overdraft that could be fixed with a quick transfer. But instead, she saw the truth. Zero. Nothing. The money was gone. The next call she made was probably to the bank, demanding answers, insisting there must have been a mistake, her voice growing sharper with every second, her frustration spilling over as she was transferred from one department to another, each representative telling her the same thing. There were no deposits, no payments, no recent activity that would explain where her money had gone. Because there was no money. It had never been hers to begin with. The second wave hit when she got home, when she found the eviction notice taped to her apartment door, a bright red final notice stamped across the top, the kind of letter that people like Jessica had never had to deal with before. She probably stood there in shock, staring at it, reading the words over and over again like they might change if she just looked hard enough. Rent unpaid. Balance overdue. Eviction pending. She didn't understand. She had always assumed that Mom was handling it, that the money was coming from somewhere, that things like rent and bills were just taken care of. Jessica had never been the kind of person who worried about things like that. She had always focused on bigger things, more important things, things like her career, her image, her future. She called Mom next. I knew that conversation wasn't going to go the way she expected. Mom had always been the peacemaker, the one who tried to smooth things over when things got tense, the one who never wanted to see either of us struggle. But she wasn't the one who had been paying the bills. And when Jessica called, demanding to know why the rent hadn't been covered, why her money had disappeared, why everything was suddenly falling apart, Mom must have been just as confused as she was. "What are you talking about, sweetheart?" she probably said, her voice gentle, genuinely concerned. "I thought you were paying your own bills. I thought you had things under control." Jessica must have felt the first real wave of fear settle into her chest then, a cold, sinking sensation that spread through her like ice water. Because if Mom wasn't paying, if the bank wasn't making a mistake, if the money was really gone, then that meant someone else had been taking care of it all along. Someone she hadn't even known was there. She must have started putting the pieces together, must have gone through every bill, every expense, every deposit, must have realized that she had never actually checked where the money was coming from. She had just assumed it would always be there, and now it wasn't. By the time the final wave hit, when the school called to inform her that her tuition payment hadn't been received, that she was at risk of being dropped from her classes, that she had only days to figure it out before she lost everything, I knew exactly what she must have been thinking. Who had been paying for all of it? Who had been taking care of her without her even knowing? Who had made sure she never had to worry about anything? And more importantly, who had just decided that she wasn't worth saving anymore? She came to my house, screaming, demanding answers. I gave her the truth, and I watched her break. I heard the tires screech outside before I even saw her car pull into my driveway, heard the slam of the car door, heard the furious click of her heels against the pavement, heard the way her breathing was already ragged and uneven before she even reached my front porch. I didn't move from my seat, didn't bother standing up, didn't even glance at the door when her fist came crashing against it, each knock louder than the last, her rage practically vibrating through the wood. "Nick!" she screamed, her voice sharp, raw, dripping with fury and desperation all at once. "Open this goddamn door right now." I didn't rush. I took my time, took one last sip of my coffee, set the mug down on the table beside me, ran a hand over my jaw before finally pushing myself up from the couch. I already knew how this was going to play out, already knew exactly what she was going to say, already knew that this conversation was going to be the final nail in the coffin of whatever relationship we had left. When I opened the door, Jessica stood there with wild eyes, her hair slightly disheveled, her cheeks flushed red from either anger or humiliation, maybe both. She didn't look like the perfectly put-together woman she always presented to the world, didn't have that carefully curated confidence that she usually wore like armor. She looked like someone whose entire life had just been flipped upside down, like someone who had spent the last 24 hours unraveling every piece of security she had ever known, only to realize that it had never belonged to her in the first place. "You," she spat, shoving past me without waiting for an invitation, her designer bag swinging violently against her side as she stormed into my house, spinning on her heel to face me the second she reached the middle of the room. "You did this. I know it was you." I shut the door behind her, exhaled slowly, leaned back against the frame, crossed my arms over my chest, and just looked at her. I didn't say a word. I wanted to see how long it would take for her to say the thing she had come here to say, how long she would dance around the truth, how long she would fight against the reality that was staring her dead in the face. "You cut me off," she continued, pacing now, her voice rising with every word, her hands moving wildly as she tried to piece together a defense before I had even said anything. "You stopped the payments, you let my rent lapse, you let my tuition go unpaid, you." She let out a bitter, humorless laugh, shaking her head, disbelief written all over her face. "I don't even understand why. Why would you do this to me?" I tilted my head slightly, let the question hang in the air between us, let her sit with the weight of it, let her think about every single word that had come out of her mouth over the years, every dismissive glance, every condescending remark, every moment she had acted like she was better than me without ever stopping to wonder how she had gotten to where she was. And then I spoke. "I did this to you," I repeated, my voice calm, level, not a hint of anger, just pure cold disbelief. "You really think that, Jess? You think I did something to you?" Her jaw clenched, her arms crossing over her chest, her shoulders squared like she was gearing up for a fight she already knew she was going to lose. "Yes, I do." "You." She faltered for a second, her eyes flickering with uncertainty before she hardened her expression again. "You were paying for everything, weren't you?" I nodded once, slow and deliberate, watching the way her lips parted slightly, the way her breathing grew just a little bit more shallow, the way realization started to settle into her bones, even if she didn't want to accept it yet. "Your tuition," I said, my voice flat. "Your rent. Your bills. Your groceries. Your entire life, Jessica. Every single thing you've had for the last 6 years? That was me." She flinched. It was subtle, just the smallest shift in her stance, but I caught it. She knew. Some part of her had probably already suspected it, had probably put the pieces together the second everything started falling apart, but hearing me say it out loud made it real in a way she couldn't ignore. "But," her voice cracked, and for a second, she actually looked small. "But why? Why would you do that? Why wouldn't you tell me?" I let out a slow breath, running a hand over my jaw, shaking my head slightly. "Because I wanted you to have a shot," I admitted, my voice quieter now, but no less firm. "Because I wanted you to be able to do something I never got to do. Because I didn't want you to have to struggle the way I did. And you know what, Jess? I never asked for a damn thing in return. Not once. I never threw it in your face, never expected gratitude, never wanted credit. But the second you decided I wasn't good enough for you, the second you sat at that Christmas dinner table and laughed about how embarrassing it would be to have a plumber in the same room as your friends, I leaned in slightly, just enough to make sure she couldn't look away, couldn't pretend she didn't understand exactly what I was saying. That was the second I realized I didn't owe you anything anymore. Jessica's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, like she wanted to argue, like she wanted to tell me I was wrong, like she wanted to find some excuse that would make all of this go away. But there was nothing she could say, nothing she could do, nothing that would change the fact that she had burned the only bridge that had ever kept her from drowning. I straightened, stepping back, nodding toward the door. "You should go, Jess." She just stood there, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite read. Anger, humiliation, regret. Maybe all of them tangled together so tightly that she didn't even know which one to feel first. And then, without another word, she turned and walked out. I didn't watch her leave. I didn't need to, because I already knew exactly what was coming next. She came to my house, screaming, demanding answers. I gave her the truth, and I watched her break. I heard the tires screech outside before I even saw her car pull into my driveway, heard the slam of the car door, heard the furious click of her heels against the pavement, heard the way her breathing was already ragged and uneven before she even reached my front porch. I didn't move from my seat, didn't bother standing up, didn't even glance at the door when her fist came crashing against it. Each knock louder than the last, her rage practically vibrating through the wood. "Nick," she screamed, her voice sharp, raw, dripping with fury and desperation all at once. "Open this goddamn door right now." I didn't rush. I took my time, took one last sip of my coffee, set the mug down on the table beside me, ran a hand over my jaw before finally pushing myself up from the couch. I already knew how this was going to play out, already knew exactly what she was going to say, already knew that this conversation was going to be the final nail in the coffin of whatever relationship we had left. When I opened the door, Jessica stood there with wild eyes, her hair slightly disheveled, her cheeks flushed red from either anger or humiliation. Maybe both. She didn't look like the perfectly put-together woman she always presented to the world, didn't have that carefully curated confidence that she usually wore like armor. She looked like someone whose entire life had just been flipped upside down, like someone who had spent the last 24 hours unraveling every piece of security she had ever known, only to realize that it had never belonged to her in the first place. "You," she spat, shoving past me without waiting for an invitation, her designer bag swinging violently against her side as she stormed into my house, spinning on her heel to face me the second she reached the middle of the room. "You did this. I know it was you." I shut the door behind her, exhaled slowly, leaned back against the frame, crossed my arms over my chest, and just looked at her. I didn't say a word. I wanted to see how long it would take for her to say the thing she had come here to say, how long she would dance around the truth, how long she would fight against the reality that was staring her dead in the face. "You cut me off," she continued, pacing now, her voice rising with every word, her hands moving wildly as she tried to piece together a defense before I had even said anything. "You stopped the payments. You let my rent lapse. You let my tuition go unpaid, you." She let out a bitter, humorless laugh, shaking her head, disbelief written all over her face. I don't even understand why. Why would you do this to me? I tilted my head slightly. Let the question hang in the air between us. Let her sit with the weight of it. Let her think about every single word that had come out of her mouth over the years, every dismissive glance, every condescending remark, every moment she had acted like she was better than me without ever stopping to wonder how she had gotten to where she was. And then I spoke. I did this to you? I repeated, my voice calm, level, not a hint of anger, just pure, cold disbelief. You really think that, Jess? You think I did something to you? Her jaw clenched, her arms crossing over her chest, her shoulders squared like she was gearing up for a fight she already knew she was going to lose. Yes, I do. You, she faltered for a second, her eyes flickering with uncertainty before she hardened her expression again. You were paying for everything, weren't you? I nodded once, slow and deliberate, watching the way her lips parted slightly, the way her breathing grew just a little bit more shallow, the way realization started to settle into her bones, even if she didn't want to accept it yet. Your tuition, I said, my voice flat. Your rent, your bills, your groceries, your entire life, Jessica. Every single thing you've had for the last 6 years? That was me. She flinched. It was subtle, just the smallest shift in her stance, but I caught it. She knew. Some part of her had probably already suspected it, had probably put the pieces together the second everything started falling apart, but hearing me say it out loud made it real in a way she couldn't ignore. But her voice cracked, and for a second, she actually looked small. But why? Why would you do that? Why wouldn't you tell me? I let out a slow breath, running a hand over my jaw, shaking my head slightly. Because I wanted you to have a shot, I admitted, my voice quieter now, but no less firm. Because I wanted you to be able to do something I never got to do. Because I didn't want you to have to struggle the way I did. And you know what, Jess? I never asked for a damn thing in return. Not once. I never threw it in your face, never expected gratitude, never wanted credit. But the second you decided I wasn't good enough for you, the second you sat at that Christmas dinner table and laughed about how embarrassing it would be to have a plumber in the same room as your friends, I leaned in slightly, just enough to make sure she couldn't look away, couldn't pretend she didn't understand exactly what I was saying. That was the second I realized I didn't owe you anything anymore. Jessica's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, like she wanted to argue, like she wanted to tell me I was wrong, like she wanted to find some excuse that would make all of this go away. But there was nothing she could say, nothing she could do, nothing that would change the fact that she had burned the only bridge that had ever kept her from drowning. I straightened, stepping back, nodding toward the door. You should go, Jess. She just stood there, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite read. Anger, humiliation, regret, maybe all of them tangled together so tightly that she didn't even know which one to feel first. And then, without another word, she turned and walked out. I didn't watch her leave. I didn't need to, because I already knew exactly what was coming next. It's funny how quickly people disappear when the money runs out. Jessica's law school threatens to drop her. She can't get a loan. Her friends abandon her, realizing she was never rich, just lucky. She tries to beg Nick to reconsider, but he won't even take her calls. Desperate, she takes a job waiting tables, humiliated but out of options. Cliffhanger asterisk, she sees Nick eating at the restaurant she works at. ChatGPT. Episode 5. The Spiral. It's funny how quickly people disappear when the money runs out. 1 minute, you're surrounded by laughter, clinking glasses, expensive brunches, invitations to exclusive events, and long, drawn-out conversations about summer vacations in Europe or ski trips in Aspen. The next minute, the phone stops ringing, the messages dry up, the dinner invitations never come, and the people you once considered your closest friends suddenly seem too busy to return a simple text. Jessica was learning that the hard way. I knew things were getting worse for her, even without her saying a word. She hadn't reached out since that night in my house, hadn't sent a single message, hadn't shown up at my door again, but I knew exactly what was happening in her world. I knew because I had lived it myself, had watched people drift away when I couldn't keep up, had seen the way respect could vanish the moment people realized you had nothing to offer them. At first, she probably thought she could fix it, that she could find some way to smooth over the cracks, that she could convince the world that everything was fine. Maybe she had convinced herself that this was just a temporary setback, that the money would somehow reappear, that there was a mistake somewhere, that something would magically solve itself before things got too bad. But then reality hit her like a freight train. The first real blow came from the law school administration, A cold, impersonal email informing her that her tuition payment had not been received and that she had exactly 1 week to settle her outstanding balance before she would be dropped from her classes. She probably sat there staring at the screen, reading the words over and over again, her mind scrambling for an answer, searching for a way out, trying to think of who she could call, where she could get the money, how she could fix something she had never had to fix before. She tried applying for a loan, but that didn't go the way she expected. No credit history, no consistent income, no co-signer. Denied. Then came the second blow, the moment she realized that her apartment was no longer hers. The landlord wasn't interested in excuses, wasn't interested in sad stories, wasn't willing to give her more time. Rent was overdue, and the eviction notice was final. She had spent years living in that upscale apartment, decorating it with furniture she assumed she had bought herself, hosting dinner parties where she played the role of a sophisticated young professional on her way to the top. And now, in a single humiliating moment, she was standing in the hallway, her belongings shoved in cheap cardboard boxes, realizing that she had no idea where she was supposed to go next. She had friends, didn't she? Friends with money, friends with connections, friends who had always called her one of them. Except, as it turned out, those friends weren't interested in broken things. The first few calls probably felt easy enough, just casual requests, quick little favors, the kind of things people in her circle did for each other all the time. Hey, I'm between apartments right now. Do you mind if I crash for a bit? Or maybe, I'm dealing with some banking issues. Could you spot me until next month? But the responses were different now. Vague excuses, sudden unavailability, polite but distant apologies. One by one, the people she had surrounded herself with disappeared, slipping away like sand through her fingers, leaving her standing there alone, wondering how she had never noticed that they weren't really her friends to begin with. And then, after exhausting every other option, after calling every number in her contact list, after trying and failing to find another way out, she did the one thing she had never thought she'd have to do. She got a job, not an internship, not a prestigious position at some law firm, not a networking opportunity that would put her in rooms with powerful people. A real job. The kind of job she had always looked down on, the kind of job she had never once considered worthy of her time, the kind of job that, only months ago, she would have told herself she was too smart, too successful, too important to ever need. Waiting tables. I don't know how long she sat in her car before walking into that restaurant. Don't know how many times she gripped the steering wheel, closed her eyes, took deep breaths, and tried to convince herself that this wasn't happening. But eventually, she did it. She walked inside, filled out an application, smiled tightly at the manager, and pretended like she had done this before. They hired her on the spot, not because of her charm, not because of her intelligence, not because of her once bright future, because they were short-staffed and they needed someone to carry plates. I didn't know about it right away. Didn't hear about it from Mom, didn't get some dramatic phone call from Jessica telling me how miserable she was, didn't see some tearful post on social media about how hard life had suddenly become. I found out by accident. I had been out with a couple of my guys from work, grabbing a meal after a long job, laughing about something stupid, unwinding after a long day of doing the kind of work that made my muscles ache and my clothes stink of sweat and dirt. We walked into a restaurant, nothing fancy, just a regular diner, the kind of place that served decent food at a decent price, the kind of place I had eaten at 100 times before without thinking twice. And then I saw her, Jessica, standing by the counter, wearing a cheap black uniform, holding an empty tray in one hand, her other hand tightening into a fist at her side the second she saw me. Our eyes met. She froze. And for the first time in her life, she looked absolutely, completely humiliated. I thought she hated me before, but when she saw me sitting at that table, she looked like she wanted to kill me. She had already been standing there, gripping that tray so hard I thought it might snap in half, frozen in place like a deer caught in headlights. I could see it all happening in real time. The way her posture stiffened, the way her eyes darted to the floor as if she could somehow make herself invisible, the way her breath hitched for just a second before she forced herself to stand up straighter. She looked different, not just because she was wearing a cheap uniform instead of her usual expensive outfits, but because she was trying so damn hard to pretend that none of this was happening, trying to convince herself that she could just get through this shift without anyone noticing how far she had fallen. And then she saw me. Her face went from pale to furious in a matter of seconds, her grip tightening on the tray, her entire body going rigid as the realization crashed down on her like a tidal wave. I didn't say anything at first, didn't move, didn't even shift in my seat. I just sat there, watching her, waiting, knowing exactly what was coming, knowing that Jessica Walker had never once in her life backed down from a fight she thought she could win. It took less than 10 seconds for her to snap. She marched across the restaurant so fast that one of the other waitresses called out after her, some half-hearted attempt at reminding her that she was in the middle of a shift, but Jessica wasn't listening. She stopped right in front of me, her breathing sharp, her fists clenched so tightly at her sides that I could see the way her nails dug into her palms. "You think this is funny?" she hissed, her voice low enough that only I could hear, but sharp enough that every single word felt like a knife being driven into the space between us. "You think this is some kind of joke?" I leaned back in my seat, letting her rage wash over me like it was nothing more than background noise, letting her stew in her own humiliation, letting her realize that I wasn't going to make this easy for her. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice casual, calm, controlled. "I'm just here for dinner." Her lips parted slightly, her breath hitching, her shoulders rising and falling as she tried to hold back the full weight of her anger. But it wasn't working. I could see it all bubbling up inside of her, threatening to explode, threatening to spill over in a way that she wouldn't be able to take back. "You ruined my life," she spat, the words dripping with venom, each syllable filled with a bitterness that I hadn't heard from her before. "You did this to me. You cut me off. You destroyed everything I worked for you." She stopped herself, shaking her head as if she couldn't even find the right words to explain just how much she hated me in that moment. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I didn't even let my expression change. I just looked her dead in the eyes and said the only thing that mattered. "Now you know what it's like to earn your place." The words hung in the air between us, heavy, final, irreversible. Jessica's breath hitched again, her nostrils flaring, her fists trembling at her sides, her entire body screaming for a reaction, for a fight, for something that would make this moment feel less like a death sentence. But I wasn't giving her that satisfaction. She wanted me to yell, to defend myself, to justify my actions, to give her some kind of opening to twist the narrative back in her favor. She wanted me to admit that I had done this to punish her, that I had taken everything away from her out of spite, that I was the villain in her story. But I wasn't going to do that. I wasn't going to give her the comfort of thinking this was about revenge. Because it wasn't. This was about reality finally catching up to her. She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. But there was no humor in it. No real amusement. Just raw, ugly humiliation wrapped in layers of anger. "You think this makes you better than me?" she sneered, shaking her head as she took a step back, her voice growing louder now, enough that the people around us were starting to take notice. "You think you're some kind of hero? Teaching me a lesson? You're pathetic, Nick. You always have been. You couldn't handle the fact that I was doing better than you, so you had to tear me down, right? That's what this is? Some twisted way to make yourself feel powerful." I still didn't react, because it didn't matter. She could scream all she wanted, could throw as many accusations at me as she needed to in order to make herself feel better, could twist the truth into something she could live with. But none of it would change the fact that she was standing in a cheap restaurant wearing a uniform she never thought she'd have to wear, serving people she once considered beneath her, struggling for the first time in her life to survive without someone else holding her up. And that had nothing to do with me. She had done that to herself. Her eyes darted around the restaurant then, finally realizing that people were watching, that her co-workers were standing frozen near the counter, whispering to each other, exchanging looks, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. She had spent her entire life controlling the way people saw her, carefully curating every detail, making sure that no one ever got too close to the truth. But now, there was no hiding. She had already lost. Her jaw clenched, her breath shaky, her entire body trembling with the weight of everything crashing down on her all at once. And then, finally, she did the one thing I knew was coming. She ripped off her apron, threw it onto the floor, and turned toward the manager who had been watching from the other side of the room. "I quit," she snapped, her voice cold, final, filled with the last bit of pride she had left. The manager just nodded, not even surprised, not even bothering to argue. And then Jessica turned back to me one last time, her eyes burning with something I couldn't quite name. Hatred, regret, fury, maybe all of it tangled together so tightly that she didn't even know which one to lean into. "You're going to regret this," she whispered, her voice low, sharp, filled with something almost dangerous. And then she turned and walked out. I sat there for a moment, listening to the sound of the restaurant slowly coming back to life around me, hearing the whispers, the quiet gasps, the murmurs of people who had just witnessed something they didn't quite understand. And all I could think was one simple thing. No, Jessica, the only person who was going to regret this was you. Some people learn through kindness. Others only learn through suffering. Jessica had spent her entire life avoiding consequences, floating through the world with the confidence of someone who had never been forced to feel the weight of her own mistakes, never had to worry about whether there would be a safety net waiting to catch her if she fell. But now, for the first time in her life, she was falling hard fast with nothing to grab onto, nothing to slow her descent, nothing to soften the impact when she finally hit rock bottom. Law school was the first thing to go. The final email came in the middle of the night, cold and impersonal, the kind of message that wasn't meant for people like her, people who had always been shielded from the uglier parts of life, people who had never imagined that something like this could happen to them. The school had given her as much time as they could, had sent multiple warnings, had offered every option available. But in the end, there was only so much patience they were willing to extend to a student who couldn't pay. The tuition deadline had passed. The account was in default. Effective immediately, she was no longer enrolled. It was over. The dream she had spent years building, the future she had mapped out in perfect detail, the life she had always assumed was guaranteed to her. It was gone in a single moment, erased by a system that didn't care about her excuses, that didn't care about her potential, that didn't care that she was supposed to be different. She was just another name on a list, just another unpaid balance, just another person who had to learn the hard way that the world didn't stop spinning just because she wanted it to. She had nowhere to go. The apartment was already gone, her landlord having wasted no time in finding a new tenant, someone who could actually pay on time, someone who wouldn't disappear the second the bills came due. The friends who had once surrounded her, the ones who had filled her weekends with brunches and cocktail parties and long conversations about career goals and expensive vacations, had already moved on, their polite but distant responses making it clear that she no longer fit into their world. She had spent years looking down on the people who had to struggle, who had to work jobs they hated, who had to scrape by just to survive, who didn't have the luxury of choosing the kind of life they wanted to live. And now, she was one of them. So she did the only thing she could. She went home. The house hadn't changed much since she left, still carrying the same scent of freshly brewed coffee in the mornings, still feeling slightly too small in some places, still holding on to memories that she had spent years trying to escape. But now, walking through the front door with nothing but a couple of suitcases and the weight of her own failure pressing down on her shoulders, it felt different. It felt like a cage. Mom tried to make her feel better, tried to tell her that things would be okay, that this was just a setback, that she could find another way, that she could rebuild. But Jessica didn't have the energy to pretend anymore, didn't have the pride left to fake another smile, didn't have the strength to keep up the illusion that she still had any control over her life. The first night back, she locked herself in her old bedroom, buried herself under the blankets, and cried harder than she ever had in her life. Days passed in a blur of silence, of forced small talk, of long stretches of time where she just sat on the couch, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of everything she had lost pressing down on her chest like a heavy stone. She had spent years believing she was better than this, better than the people who struggled, better than the people who didn't make it, better than the people who had to start over with nothing. But now, she was exactly where she had once sworn she would never be, back in her childhood home, broke, unemployed, and completely, utterly lost. And then finally she broke. It happened in the kitchen, a quiet Sunday morning when the world outside felt deceptively normal, when the sun was streaming through the windows, when the scent of coffee filled the air like nothing had changed. Mom was washing dishes, humming softly to herself, pretending that everything was fine, pretending that her daughter wasn't falling apart right in front of her, pretending that things could still be fixed. Jessica stood there for a long time, gripping the edge of the counter, staring at the way the soap suds swirled in the sink, her breath shallow, her hands shaking, her entire body tense with something she couldn't hold back anymore. And then, just like that, the words tumbled out of her mouth before she could stop them. "I was wrong." Mom froze, the dish in her hands slipping slightly, her eyes widening as she turned to look at Jessica, as if she wasn't sure she had heard her correctly, as if she couldn't believe that the words had actually been spoken. Jessica's voice cracked, her shoulders trembling, her throat tightening around the confession she had spent so long refusing to admit. "I was wrong about everything, Mom. About Nick. About what he did for me. About who I was. Her breath hitched, and then, without warning, she sank to the floor, her legs folding beneath her, her entire body shaking as the weight of it all finally crushed her. "I was so awful to him. I didn't see it. I didn't." A choked sob escaped her lips, raw and unfiltered, the kind of sound that came from somewhere deep, from a place of real, unshakable regret. "I don't know how to fix it." Mom knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around her, whispering soft reassurances, smoothing her hair like she had when she was a child. And for the first time in years, Jessica let herself cry in her mother's arms. Let herself be vulnerable. Let herself feel the full weight of everything she had lost, everything she had thrown away. Later that night, Mom called me. She told me everything, told me how Jessica had finally broken down, told me how she had finally admitted the truth, told me how she wanted to make things right. And then, softly, carefully, she asked me the question I had been waiting for. Do you think you can forgive her? I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know what to say, not because I didn't care, not because I wanted to keep punishing Jessica, but because at that very moment I was standing in front of a real estate agent, signing the final papers on something that was going to change everything. I had just bought something that would leave everyone speechless. I held her future in my hands. And for the first time, she knew it. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I wasn't trying to drag this out longer than it needed to go. I wasn't even trying to make her suffer. She had already done enough of that on her own, already felt the weight of everything she had lost, already stood at the edge of the life she once knew, staring at the ruins of what used to be. But this was different. This was something she had never expected, something she never could have imagined, something that forced her to see me in a way she had never seen me before. I had bought her spot at law school. Not for her. Not to fix things. Not to swoop in and save the day at the last second. I had bought it for myself. Because after years of telling myself that my future had never mattered, after years of putting everyone else ahead of me, after years of sacrificing so that Jessica could chase her dreams while I buried mine, I had finally made a decision that wasn't about her. It wasn't about revenge, it wasn't about proving a point, and it sure as hell wasn't about making her feel small. It was about giving myself the chance I had never taken, about reclaiming something I had let go of a long time ago, about showing myself that I was worth more than just being the guy who picked up the pieces for everyone else. But Jessica didn't see it that way. Not at first. She came to my house again, not screaming this time, not demanding answers, not lashing out the way she had before. She looked different now, looked like someone who had been humbled, looked like someone who had spent too many nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. Her clothes weren't designer anymore. Her hair wasn't styled to perfection. Her nails weren't carefully manicured like they had been when she lived a life of luxury. She looked like someone who had finally seen the truth of the world, who had finally understood what it meant to have nothing. She knocked, soft and hesitant, a far cry from the way she had pounded on my door the last time. I let her in without a word, stepping aside, watching as she hesitated in the doorway, like she wasn't sure she was welcome. She knew. She knew what I had done. She had found out somehow, had probably checked with the school, had probably been searching for some kind of last-minute miracle, had probably been willing to do anything to get her spot back, only to realize that it wasn't hers to take anymore. I could see the question in her eyes before she even opened her mouth, could see the way she was bracing herself for the answer, could see the way her pride was fighting against her desperation, the way her old arrogance was battling against the raw, crushing reality of what her life had become. Why? She finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do this? I didn't answer right away, didn't rush to explain, didn't try to soften the blow for her. I just looked at her, letting her sit with the weight of it, letting her feel every single part of what this meant. You called me just a plumber, I said finally, my voice steady, even filled with something she couldn't argue with. But my money was good enough for you, wasn't it? She flinched. It was subtle, just the slightest movement, but it was there. She wanted to fight back, wanted to defend herself, wanted to say something, anything, to shift the blame away from her, to make this about me being cruel, about me taking things too far. But she couldn't, because she knew. She knew that I had been the reason she had made it as far as she did. She knew that without me, she would have never set foot in that school, would have never had that apartment, would have never lived the life she had been so proud of. And now, she knew that I was the reason she wasn't going back. Her shoulders slumped slightly, her chin trembling, her hands curling in a fist at her sides like she was trying to hold herself together, trying to keep from completely falling apart. But she wasn't strong enough anymore. She didn't have the armor she used to wear, didn't have the privilege of standing above it all, didn't have the luxury of pretending she was untouchable. Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time in years, I saw my little sister, the real Jessica, not the version of her that she had built for the world, not the cold, polished, untouchable woman she had spent so much time becoming. Just Jessica, the girl who used to run barefoot in the backyard, who used to sit on Dad's shoulders, who used to cry when she scraped her knees but always got back up again. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely holding together, the words breaking apart at the edges. I was awful to you. I was blind. I didn't see it. I didn't. She exhaled sharply, wiping at her face, shaking her head like she couldn't believe how far she had fallen. I don't know how to fix this. I looked down at the envelope in my hand, the tuition check already written, already ready to go, the final decision sitting right there between us. I could tear it up. I could sign it. I could make the call that would change everything, that would give her a second chance, that would let her rebuild the life she had thrown away. She wasn't entitled to it. She didn't deserve it.